You're recording?
Yeah.
Welcome to the 13th lecture of the 70th anniversary lecture series of the School of International Studies. This initiative commemorating completion of 70 years of our school this was taken by our Dean, Prof. and it takes us back to 1955 when Indian School of International Studies was a part of ICWA. We've had 12 lectures so far. This is since last October, and we're going to go on till September, October of this year. And it has lectures that range from international studies in India, discussions on the Nobel Peace Prize of Economics, international law, India's development, its foreign policy, its quest for status in international politics. There is one on China's foreign policy, which was delivered by a Japanese professor, and on Trump administration and West Asia, human rights, AI-based digital technologies, and so on. I think the last one was on globalization of public health. So the lectures have been delivered by our alumni, international analysts who have been really reputed ones, academics, and of course former professors of our school. Today we are very pleased to welcome Professor S.D. Muni. I don't think he really needs an introduction, but as you all know, he is Professor Emeritus at our school, and he will be speaking to us on US regime change in South Asia. For about 4 decades, from 1974, and so you can correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Muni has taught international relations and South Asian studies at JNU. From 2008, he was with the National University of Singapore for about 5-6 years. He served as India's special envoy to Southeast Asian countries on UN Security Council reforms, represented India's Minister of External Affairs at the 50th anniversary celebrations of the Paris Peace Conference. He also served as India's ambassador to Laos and was nominated as the first ever constituted National Security Advisory Board of India in 1999. He is the founding executive member of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies at Colombo, and in 2005 was bestowed with the Sri Lanka Ratna Award. This is Sri Lanka's highest national honor for a foreign national. The Institute of National Securities Studies at Colombo offered him affiliation as Honorary Distinguished Fellow in 2016, and the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS had appointed him as Honorary Fellow of the Institute. In October of 2014, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from Sri Venkateshwar University. He's also been honored by Delhi University for his contributions to India-Nepal relations. He's author and editor of about, so many books, as many research articles, and his latest on, I think, was on dabbling in diplomacy, which was in 2024. And of course, founder of some prestigious journals. I won't get into that because I think the more I talk, the more I have to say. So with those words, I welcome Professor Muni again, and I request Professor Matru to give a token of our appreciation from the side of the school.
Before performance. Thank you for taking you. I'm going home.
And I request Professor Matru to please preside.
Thank you very much, Professor Preeti Singh, who is also the grand custodian of the school, and all the other team members. What can I say about Professor S.D. Muni to this audience? Professor Muni has been for, I think, almost all of us in this room, and many sitting on this side of the room, Guru. In the tradition of Kabir, and Sanjay Bhagwat will correct me if I get the doha wrong, Guru Govind khade hue, Guru Govind khade hue, Kaako laakhe pao. Fir aage? So even though Professor Muni never taught me, he did not take MA classes, and I didn't join South Asia, but he was a guru in a larger sense of the word. When I entered JNU, he was there, but he then went on a sabbatical. I first met him when he was a visiting scholar at Oxford, and I was doing my PhD there. And I met him and I heard his lecture there. He was recognized even then as probably the leading thinker on South Asia, as someone who was not just hardworking but had new ideas and a tremendous degree of scholarship on almost every country of South Asia. We became colleagues thereafter, and one of my regrets I'll express today was, however, born out of not enthusiasm but youthful rebellion, because Professor Muni was appointed to the Abutrai chair in Seaport. But we were young, radical, anti-establishment people who decided that without consulting the center, no one could be appointed as a faculty member, especially from outside. And to our great regret, we were deprived of Professor Muni's scholarship and mentorship during those years. Professor Muni, as you all know, has straddled many roles, has had a very humble beginnings. Although born in a Brahmanical tradition, he grew up and really worked hard in Rajasthan. He became part of the Rajasthan, what used to be called the Rajasthan Mafia in JNU, with C.P. Bhamri and Jaipur Mafia, of which Sanjay Bhardwaj is the latest entrant. But the Jaipur Mafia, which had presence in CPS, in South Asia, in School of Social Sciences, but a lesser presence in SIS, with K.K. Mishra and yourself, and was there anyone else from the Jaipur Mafia? Sushil Kumar, with whom Professor Muni had a difficult relationship. But so Jaipur Mafia was not a mafia. They could often have different dons, as it were, if you are thinking of the mafia as a syndicate. But thereafter, Professor Muni, I remember once again as a young associate professor, we thought that we could do whatever we wanted since we were in JNU. I had invited Mushahid Hussain, who was then the Minister of Information and Broadcasting in Pakistan, I think Nawaz Sharif's first government. He was sitting here and Professor Muni walked in, and Mushahid Hussain, I remember distinctly saying to him, Mubarak hai Muni Saab, I've just come after speaking to Gujral Saab and you've been appointed ambassador. Professor Muni hadn't disclosed it, but that was the first time we heard of his appointment as ambassador to Laos. The greatest tragedy of India's establishment is that it actually gives promotions, values people, but puts them in the wrong place. Professor Muni should have been ambassador to Sri Lanka, to Nepal, even by a stretch to Pakistan. But even in Laos, I think he made a tremendous difference, although Vientiane is not the place where India, an unconventional diplomat could have made a big difference, but even then, because of his understanding of ASEAN and the politics of Southeast Asia, I think he made a difference. So he is one of the two Professor Emeritus in the school, Professor Ashok Boa being the other. Professor Muni is personally, and Mrs. Muni is personally, the most generous host wherever you go, whether it's in Singapore or whether you went to JNU. Professor Anuradha Muni makes the greatest dal that I've ever had, which I keep repeating, the best vegetarian food ever that I've eaten on campus was in the Muni. Personally, Professor Muni is a hard taskmaster. Everyone recognizes that he's intolerant of people who are not as scholarly or hardworking. So that often alienates. That for a long time alienated me from Professor Muni. That he's intolerant of anyone who may not come to the similar standards of his scholarship. And he's often outspoken enough to say, oh, you don't know anything. I remember the first seminar I gave in the United Nations, he came and he tore my paper apart. And I, as a young associate professor, I was very, very shaken, but then said, oh sir, you must be you're probably holding the national flag. I don't need to hold the national flag right now. He got a little upset, but he never held that against me. But I always say, and I tell him that you're a Sufi. Why do I say you're a Sufi? Is because a Sufi is known for often hurling abuses on people, but they prosper because of the spirit with which it is said. So I have grown through all the criticism that Professor Muni has showered on me, along with all the affection. And many of his students have gone through similar experience. Professor Sadevan, Professor Sanjay Bhargava, or anyone who's been taught to him, that he is a difficult person, a difficult taskmaster. Even his Mrs. Muni will testify to that he is not the easiest person, but intellectually he is a giant. I am saying this openly today because there are rare opportunities one gets to speak about someone with the same degree of intellectual prowess as Professor Muni. As there are few examples of his scholarship, both in terms of academic, intellectual, theoretical wisdom, as well as policy wisdom. He had deep personal friendship with Chandrika Kumaratungi, Bandaranaike Srimao's daughter. Similarly, he could speak to anyone in the Nepal politics. Baburam Bhattarai was a personal student. He mentored him. Even today, when he goes to Nepal, it makes news before he has actually stepped in Nepal. So, with all these qualities, he is sui generis. We have only one Professor S.T. Muni, so it is my great honor and pleasure as the Dean to invite him to deliver the 13th lecture and to do so in the usual candor and with this usual depth of scholarship, because what I know he's going to speak about today is important at this juncture in history as it was in the past, America's role in regime change in South Asia. Professor Muni, sir.
Thank you, Professor Mathu. You have put me at a great disadvantage. Firstly, to begin with, I must thank you and the colleagues for giving me this opportunity to speak on this series. But your introduction and the long narrative is both overwhelming and humbling. Actually, just one correction. Gujarat did ask me to go to Sri Lanka first, and then I said, no, I can't go. And he said, I am amazed why are you saying no. I said, look, Chandrika is a personal friend. She became a friend much before she became president, and she was our faculty member here. For 15 days we called her here. So if I go there, if I do something wrong or if something happens wrong to India-Sri Lanka relations, they will blame her for my friendship and they will blame me for her friendship. And that will come on you as a Prime Minister. I knew that Gujarat government was, to begin with, a very shaky government, and I didn't want him to put him in any trouble. So I said no to him. And then Laos was decided by Salman Haider and his colleagues as to where should I be going. But that's not important. I'm really honored with the presence of all of you, and I thank you for this opportunity. One advantage which I have in meeting you is that it gives me a very false feeling though, abhi to main jawan hu. Because meeting you, interacting with you, meeting ideas with each other, I feel that yes, I still have long years to go. I don't know how difficult they would be, but that's what it is. So thanks for the opportunity. The subject I have chosen is politically unwise and inappropriate at a time when Modi Sarkar and Trump Sarkar are on the best of the relations with each other. And I think it is good for India. So it may send a wrong signal, but I have no intention to undermine this relationship. And I know that this relationship in the given context is necessary. But then why I take this subject for two reasons. For one reason, main reason, I want to draw attention and want to appeal to colleagues here and Amitabh particularly, that we probably have done very little work on policy studies. And I think regime change is a very important integrated component of the policy toolkit in terms of foreign policy analysis. There are writings by journalists and there are writings by people who have worked in different occasions, practitioners. Very few academic studies have come up where we take foreign policy objective of regime change and what is there behind it and what really happens. So I want to encourage this relatively, not absolutely, but relatively less explored area of policy research. And that's where one intention of this is. Secondly, US is not the only one which indulges in regime change. The Russians, the Soviet Union have done it, the Chinese do it. And hold your heart, India has been doing it at several places. Tell me how many studies done in SIS have ever focused on India as a regime changer. We haven't done it. We are all partly very patriotic, nationalist, and partly shy of doing that. But there is a real problem. The problem is that there is not enough data on this kind of a subject, and there is a lot more scope for speculation and assumptions which are there. Therefore, it is not done. But I will encourage you to go into this area and see if there are possibilities of doing it. The whole purpose of a foreign policy is to extract a desirable response from the other party. And what happens in regime change is that you try all other methods. And I think regime change comes almost as the last one, with military intervention or direct intervention as it is. Therefore, I am not saying that regime change is the front-loaded foreign policy objective, but it is an important objective. Now, why I choose US out of and I would encourage you to work on India if possible, if you have courage, and if you can dig into the material in one way or the other. But why I choose US? Because US is perhaps the most frequent, extensive user of regime change as compared to others. I have got some studies. One study says, and I can give you those references later on whenever you want me. One study says 64 regime changes operations between 47 and 89. And many more overt ones. These are the covert ones. There is yet another study which averages the US did the largest electoral foreign interventions between 46 and 2000. The study is by David Levins. So you have this country emerging out as one of the major practitioners of this format of foreign policy. Now, for some examples, during Cold War era, just to remind us, Iran, 1953, when Mossadegh was removed and Shah was reinstated. Guatemala, 1954, CIA deposed President Jacob Arbenz. In Chile, 1973, military coup to oust President Salvador Allende. These are well-recognized international examples. After Cold War, in the post-Cold War 21st century, Iraq, I will not say much about that, Libya and Syria, which is almost still going on. These are the landmark events. There are many other examples which are there on all these studies which are there. Why regime change? Largely because of strategic interests during Cold War years to contain USSR and China, or any adversarial presence or influence of these two countries, these two adversaries of the US. Ideological preference for democracy versus communism as it was, economic interests, access to resources, trade particularly also is it. What were the instruments of that? Military force, diplomatic pressures, economic sanctions, covert operations, including, and covert operations had all kinds of varieties. It had electoral interventions, breaking coalitions, use of insurgencies and protest movements, either sponsor or encourage opposition, public protests, social unrest, economic unrest, media manipulations and fake news. These are all part of the covert, and assassinations of course. And I'll give you some examples. So there are various instrumentalities which come into the play. In fact, by 1976, there were so many of such examples, and mark this year, from 69 to 77 is the Kissinger year of the US diplomacy. And there were maximum number of which were being fed back into the US, and there were a lot of restlessness in the Congress. And the Congress therefore appointed a committee called Church Committee, which went into many of these operations. And it came out revealing so many things. I'll give you a quote from Church Committee later on, but these were the consequences. These were the reactions. That's why I thought we must focus on the US. What were the consequences of these regime changes? Of course, destruction, instability, civil war, rise of anti-American sentiment, and radicalization and extremism. Now, this is how it has proceeded. So this is the background in which we must look at the US policy as it is. Come back to South Asia. The grounds of regime change were laid down in the very first national security document on South Asia, signed by the President in January 1951, and that is called NSC 98/1. And I give you a quotation from that, what it said. It said, "The time has come to pursue our objectives in South Asia with more vigor. We must henceforth more frequently accept calculated risks in attacking the problems of South Asia. Development of an attitude," mind these words, "development of an attitude in South Asia which would assist the United States and its allies to obtain the facilities desired in the time of peace or required in the event of war, and which would prevent the USSR from obtaining military support or assistance from these nations directly or indirectly. Access by the United States and friendly countries, which means allies essentially, to the resources and markets of the region, and creation of conditions which would lead the governments of South Asia to deny these resources to the Soviet bloc." Lot of statement is there, and then it says, "Continuation in power of the non-communist governments in the region was the minimum requirement." So it was a question of what kind of governments you really want to have. Now this policy was in 51. Obviously, its parameters and implementation could not remain the same. Things have moved around here in so many other ways. And if you look at broadly, you find that the US larger states have been in three broad regions: Europe, West Asia, they call it Middle East, and Asia Pacific. Even with the allies, you see, there are a lot of examples of regime manipulations in all these three regions because there were vast interests of these countries. And things have evolved depending on the context in which a policy was being pursued. And sometimes that context had to change. And I give you an example from the Trump one, when he said, talking about Afghanistan, he said, "The US strategic approach has, for instance, we will no longer, I quote, we will no longer use military might to construct democracy in faraway lands or try to build other countries in our own image. Those days are now over. Instead, we will work with the allies and partners to protect our shared interests to pursue common goal. But you know, Trump is considered a maverick, and therefore the policy parameters have not changed. And I'll give you an example. During the Biden administration, there were two major changes in South Asia, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. We'll talk about that. So it has evolved depending upon how the situation grows and develops, both regionally and in the international context. So the basic assumptions of this policy have remained there, and we see them, we witness them every now and then. Now, in South Asia, there are three categories, I would say, in which US has applied the regime change. One category where the regime change is direct and relatively forceful. Second category where it is indirect and sophisticated. And third category where there is a casual. Now, in the first category are three countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now in Afghanistan, I have a lot of data. I think we'll run out of the time. Let me say a couple of broad things about it. In Afghanistan, the intervention started following the Soviet invasion, and it was to undo the Soviet invasion, but also to undo the government which was appointed by the Soviet Union. But militarily, the US has later on intervened to dislodge Al-Qaeda or Taliban, because Al-Qaeda came out of the Taliban in 2001, and in 2020 to relodge Taliban for the negotiated settlement. There are some extremely exposing interviews by Ghani, in which he says how disgracefully humiliated he was thrown out of Afghanistan. And in negotiating with the Taliban, the US never took Afghan government into consideration. So at the governmental level, both Hamid Karzai and Ghani were the appointees of the US. Of course, they were done through one Loya Zirga, another through elections, and the election was counted and recounted even after Abdullah's contest about that. But that happened. Both of them were quite disappointed and frustrated when they were dished out by the US. So the regime you set up and you change it largely because it suits your policy, not the country concerned. It's a very complex and messy operations in Afghanistan which have gone in. I have several references about that. At least one I can mention it by Steve Cole, Directorate S, the CIA and America's secret wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan, 2001 to 2016. There are many other references. I have it. I don't want to read it out because of the time constraints. Now Pakistan is another example, and Pakistan also there are several examples. I'll illustrate two of them. One is 1951, and that is assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan, who was the Prime Minister at that time. Now there is no concrete evidence, but you must read the book by one of our earlier deans, M.S. Venkatram, who has done a lot of work on it, and he gives detailed account of how the complicity of US was very, very clear there. And he brings out that it was a coordinated coalition effort between the disgruntled Pakistanis who wanted Liaquat Ali out and the US. But why did US want Liaquat Ali out? After Jinnah, I think the Pakistan-India relations would have been very different, correct me, Amitabh, if Jinnah and Liaquat had survived. The whole change came about that after that, and largely due to the US intervention. Liaquat Ali refused to accept the US demand and need for sending troops to Korea. The US wanted about 50,000 troops to be sent to Korea, where they were having a tough war. Yet they said no more than 5,000 we would be able to spare. Liaquat was the one who invited Soviets and was willing to have relations with the Soviets. Liaquat was the one who was not in favor of alliance with the US and was largely leaning towards a non-aligned posture as it was. And lastly, Liaquat was the one who was seen in Washington as leaning towards the left forces in Pakistan, including Z.A. Bhutto was considered the left forces in Pakistan. So, Liaquat was eliminated. The assassination happened in a manner in Rawalpindi, and the assassin was killed on the spot, which completely finished the sources of further investigations, and investigations were very poor. But I would recommend you go through Venkat Ramji's book and you will find lot more details. There are several other references to that, where later on also, where Liaquat Ali's assassination is put on the US. Then you have the whole question of military coup in Pakistan. Muhammad Ayub wrote the first military dictator wrote his biography. And he says, in 52 we decided that we must build our army. It took us about 6 or 7 years, which is 57 to 58. And that was the time when coup was carried out. Not only this, after Liaquat's assassination, Pakistan entered into alliances because those who were quite pliable to the US were in power, and the military alliances were 53-54. In fact, I remember having read and also written somewhere as to Nehru wanted to settle the Kashmir issue in 53-54, and he pleaded with the Americans through the Canadian ambassador here, who has written in his memoir. He pleaded with them that please wait for a year or two and we will sort out this problem. But that was not American priority. So they go ahead and started supplying arms to Pakistan, which led to the emergence of military build-up in Pakistan and eventually a coup by Pakistan military. And after that, Pakistan has seen this civil military conflict. And the US has been working, keeping the army in the forefront. So a lot of coups which have taken place are done by the army. But like Bhutto, you don't get a direct evidence of the US working behind it. But Bhutto, recall his book called The Myth of Independence. Recall his efforts to build nuclear capability for Pakistan. He was charged that he had rigged the elections, and he did. And he confessed that he has rigged the elections. But with PNA, Pakistan National Alliance, which was opposite to PPP, Pakistan People's Party, he sat down, negotiated and resolved the solution, and the coup took place after that. They had not signed the agreement. Bhutto had gone on a foreign trip which was scheduled. He came back. By the time he came back, Zia, who was appointed by him as the chief, took over. So there is a lot of, in fact, assumptions and writings which indicate the help. Even Zia's death, there is a needle of suspicion towards the US as to what happened. So there are a lot of examples of there. If you have questions, we will go into them. At one time, they even tried to bring about a coalition between Benazir Bhutto and General Musharraf. General Musharraf's coup was also endorsed completely, and they tried to do it, but somehow did not succeed because Benazir was assassinated at that time. Now the latest is in Pakistan's case is Imran Khan, and Imran Khan has openly said that Daniel Lu, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. Daniel. He is the one who told the Pakistani ambassador that either you get rid of Imran Khan or our relations would not be good. And this was 2 days, 1 day or 2 days before the vote of confidence which was there. So actually Imran is thrown out of vote of confidence. But Imran had openly and publicly said that this is due to the US. Now in question of, then we come to Bangladesh, 75 2 again of Mujibur Rahman. This publication by Lawrence Lifshutz on Bangladesh, The Unfinished Revolution. The book was published in 1979, and there it gives tremendous evidence to see how CIA was involved in all that. But he gives 1 or 2 annexes of the 2 interviews. One by the CIA station head there, and another one by the assistant who was working for Kissinger. And he says Kissinger hated Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And he hated Sheikh Mujibur Rahman for 2-3 things. One, of course, was that Bangladesh emerged at the, opposite to the nose of the Americans. They did not want it to emerge, but it did happen. So he was very unhappy with that setup it had to do. But secondly, there was an effort before the emergence of Bangladesh, and they call Calcutta conferences, where the CIA worked to bring about Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the Pakistan army to some sort of a deal to avoid the emergence of Bangladesh. And Sheikh Mujib refused to do that. And that was, Kissinger at that time was using Pakistan, as you know, for building his links with China. From 69 onwards he was doing it. But at that time, therefore, he was banking on the army very much. Bhutto was not in picture so far as these consultations were concerned. So at that time, Mujib was a commodity which Kissinger thought he could not handle it properly. So that assistant says that he wanted to almost take a revenge on him. So there are other reasons about it. They say that Mujib had tilted towards the left and he was not governing well, so many other reasons. But Kissinger's element is very, very important about it. So 1971 was sort of taking revenge for the humiliation which the US had suffered, or the US decision makers had suffered. And then comes this President Hasina's ouster through. I have done a piece for the SIS blog where I have devoted some space on that. If you want to see that, you can go and have a look at that, which gives some evidence of. I think Sanjay would probably give more details about it. But the fact remains that Hasina had publicly said that the Americans, she said in one of the statements, saying that a country of white people, that she has a threat to her regime from a country of white-skinned people. She did not say America. While in India she had said it openly, that the Americans wanted 2 specific agreements out of Bangladesh. One is about the acquisition and cross-services agreement, and the second is about naval facilities and, the second is general security of military information and agreement. In addition to these 2 agreements, they also wanted some facilities on St. Martin Island for surveillance in Indian Ocean and all that. And all of them, Hasina said she totally refused. The problem was also that the Americans did not like the way Hasina was doing a balancing game between China, India, China and the US. And they were very, very unhappy with that kind of a thing. So after the elections, even January 24 elections, they refused to endorse Hasina's electoral victory. Now here I can tell you a personal anecdote. I don't know if you remember a foreign minister of Bangladesh called Iftikhar Chaudhry. Now Iftikhar Chaudhry was he was doing a PhD when we were in Australia, myself and Ayub were both there. So I have known him for a long time. And in Singapore he was my colleague also in the Institute of South Asian Studies. From after 2009 when the elections first took place, there was a provision of the interim administration which should bring about the elections. And Iftikhar Chaudhry was also foreign minister in the interim administration as well. So he had stakes there. Ifti continued to tell me that next time 2013 elections, he went thrice to the US and he said, I am going to the State Department. I said, what have you to do with the State Department? He said that the State Department wants elections to be held only with the interim manager. The US has always been consistently in support of the BNP since Zia's coming to power, consistently. And there has been no let-up on that. And they were never very happy with India cultivating Hasina and the Awami League. So this is a long-drawn contradiction which had taken place. And in 24 elections, and before that in 19 elections, they all the time wanted interim arrangement to be there so that Hasina cannot run the elections in her own way. In no way, please don't misunderstand me, I am not standing to defend Hasina for what she did in Bangladesh, the way she ran about it. But the American displeasure for Hasina is deep-rooted. That's what I want to underline. And the American preference for the BNP is also very deep-rooted. These two things are very, very clear. So you have reports and you can see some of the references I have given in that SIS block, and I'll leave it. So you find that these are the more direct ones which are there. Then we come to India. I don't know how many of you have read that is Moynihan's sort of autobiography, A Dangerous Place. He calls India a dangerous place where he had served about the 2 years which served. He left his office in, I think, 75. He published the book soon after that, 76 or so, and or 78. But in 78, when there was a Janata government, it came out in parliamentary discussions. The issue was that the CIA had given money to Mrs. Indira Gandhi to topple the Kerala communist government of EMS Namboodiripad. EMS Namboodiripad government was the first communist government coming to power through democratic elections. The communists had come through revolutions, but this was the first example, and through democratic elections it came up. So it rang alarms in Washington, and even Nehru was worried about it. Mrs. Gandhi was made president of the Congress at that time, and as a president she went there. There are various accounts whether Nehru had approved of it or not, but there are accounts also that Nehru had not approved. Mrs. Gandhi was assisting about it. She got money to topple the communist government. She organized to protest against the government there on rice issue, on education policies. They were there, and as a result, there was a lot of chaos, disturbances in Kerala, and that was used as an excuse for dismissing the government under Article 356 or something, which is there. So this was done in a democratic way in all that. But Moynihan publicly named Mrs. Gandhi, who was given money by the CIA. And that he does after the emergency for which he had seen. And this is true, that Mrs. Gandhi had started talking about the foreign hand from 1973-74 onwards. And the American unhappiness with Mrs. Gandhi was well known from 1971 onwards. You see 1971, her negotiations with, talks with Nixon on Bangladesh, and they say it was a dialogue of the deaf. No one was listening to what the other was saying, they were just saying what they wanted to say. Then Mrs. Gandhi's nuclear explosion in 74, which they did not like. Then Mrs. Gandhi's survival in politics with the help of communists in it. And this was the point, because Mrs. Gandhi depended more on Dange of the CPI and other, and this is what Moynihan wanted to say, that look, come on, we had funded her to topple a communist regime. The emergency was bad. Again, we are not defending that. But in emergency, the coming together of the diverse forces, particularly the RSS, BJP on the one hand, and socialist on the other hand, was a very interesting phenomenon which came about. the report of what I said, this church committee report, which really said church committee in 76 says what CIA is capable of, how does it work. I read out from the church committee one small extract. The CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times to influence the opinion through the use of covert propaganda. This is a congressional report, it's open public. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers and other foreign media outlets. Now this was the extent. So you look at the propaganda, and we were in JNU again of the 77 elections which took place after emergency. The CRS was one of the polling centers, and I had gone to vote there, and I know, and now we can talk about it, some of our own students, O.N. Shukla and others. That election was totally rigged in Center of Russian Studies, I can stay for seconds. So the 1977 elections threw out Mrs. Gandhi, and for right reasons, but the elections were not fair. And that was indicated in 1980 when she really staged back. How come people changed so suddenly and so quickly? Whatever. So that was one instance which was absolutely important, we must keep in mind. 1957, Kerala dismissal and the emergency period needs to be looked into. In fact, she had put a lot of curbs on the American scholars, lot of curbs on the Indian scholars, even Rajni Kothari and others. It was ruthless. The whole administration of emergency was ruthless, but Americans were involved in one way or the other in the protests and ensuring that she no longer survived in politics. She has some excellent interviews you have not seen, and if you have time and inclination, do see her, watch her one interview with Thames TV.
Prof.
Yes. Wherein she talks very clearly about what we think were her mistakes and her blunders and what the Shah Commission or the judgments which were there. Then we come to Sri Lanka. Now in Sri Lanka, the US imposed sanctions on Sri Lanka way back in 1951. The issue was the question of selling rubber to communist countries. The United Nations had taken a decision. United Nations had taken after the Korean War in one way or the other, or the stopping of the Cold War intensification, that rubber strategic material would not be sent to communist countries, or there was some what you call the export regulations to see which destination it is going there. Sri Lanka was not a member of the UN at that time, and Sri Lanka decided to continue to sell because they needed rice very badly. They were, and China, then they entered into a deal in 52 with China called rice rubber barter deal, in which rubber was given in barter to getting rice, and this was, so they put, they threatened that we will stop trade with you. They regulated the rice trade in terms of which rice needed very badly by the Sri Lankans. And they stopped assistance which was being given to Sri Lanka. So much so that Sri Lankan government at that time of D.S. Senanayake and Dudley Senanayake later on ran into problems with public protests because rice was not available, and Dudley Senanayake had to resign because of that, and the government went down. And there were elections when the D.S. Senanayake again came up. So 1951 is one instance, but the second instance is 23-24. Of the throwing of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The American policy has been very unhappy with the Chinese leading of the Rajapakshas, and Rajapakshas also worked very ruthlessly, including on the human rights of the Tamil entities elimination in 2009. which were there in the Geneva being issued raised again and again, and all kind of restrictions were there. So there were problems so far as Sri Lanka was concerned from the liberal free world point of view. So they had this grouse against the Rajapakshas and did not want them to continue. Though Gotabaya Rajapaksa had a dual citizenship. He migrated to America, got the American citizenship, and came back to Sri Lanka only when his brother became president and made him the defense secretary. And as a defense secretary, he was ruthless in dealing with the opposition of all types, including Tamils. But Tamils is just one example that it was there. Now this movement which rose up on the economic issues, and a lot of role by the IMF there. And some Sri Lankans have written scathing pieces on how IMF has misused. You know, the whole allegation was that Sri Lanka has a debt problem vis-a-vis China. But it was actually, China was 15 to 20% debt, not much. The rest of the debt was with the international agencies, including IMF. And some of the private American capitalists buying bonds from them. Now, if the economy was running into problems and Sri Lanka was not paying it, why did the IMF did not alert Sri Lanka earlier? And what they wanted to do later on, why it was not done earlier? These are the questions raised by some of the Sri Lankans about it. So the IMF had a lot of role to play in that economic uprising, people's uprising on economic issues in Sri Lanka because of the debt burden. And that movement, Aragalaya, which they call it, people's uprising, was actually American Ambassador Julie Chang. She was seen around there. Their food, their lighting, their state of the protesters was there. She was then noticed going and having talks and consultations with the JDP, which was a strong section of leading that movement, and later on supporting Anurag Kumara Bandaranaike, even taking his trip to the US where he had gone. Of course, he had gone to other countries. He came to India also, and he had gone to China also. But that trip was sponsored by the American embassy in Colombo, and support for this came up. There again, they had the renewal of their SOFA agreement, which was to come about the stationing of the forces and all that. So they had defense interest in having watchful eyes on Indian Ocean, and Gotabayas and Rajapakshas were not acceptable to them. So this is how it happened in Sri Lanka. Now about the casual one, I think I'll almost stop here, except one or two points. In casual, I have mentioned about Nepal, Sikkim. Hokuk was married to Chogyal, and that provoked India to bring about a regime change in Sikkim. It was India's doing. On Sikkim, some books have been done, studies have been, but mostly practitioners or journalists have done it. Then also to some extent in Maldives. So in Nepal, during the Maoist movement, before the Maoist movement, Rana Kresi, when Ranas were thrown out through Nehru's mediation, it was Britain and America which endorsed Gyanendra, who was a baby at that time, whom the Ranas had declared as the king, and they did not want Tribhuvan to be there, they wanted to remove, dethrone Tribhuvan. The Americans supported Gyanendra at that time. And Americans also supported Gyanendra after royal massacre in Nepal in 2001, in which the whole Gyanendra family was eliminated. So these are the grey areas which one must look into. Now let me just conclude by an overview. Firstly, the frequency and intensity of regime change both during the Cold War in recent years was largely to enhance geopolitical competition with China. Now what is happening is Russia is not in that much of a competition. During the Cold War years, the Americans, even in regime change operations, were guided by the British. They did not know much about South Asia, much about Asia. Of course, later on in Thailand, in Philippines, in Indonesia, bringing of Suharto, the Americans had played a role, but earlier they had the British which guided them. all instruments of regime change policies have been employed, but less of the direct military interventions in South Asia, which has happened elsewhere. There is, except for one or two, you cannot really have, except in Afghanistan, you can't see a direct American military playing any role. Strategic interests have been the main driver of regime change policies, which are closely followed by the economic interests. And legitimacy of these initiatives have been done on the basis of that we want a democratic regime. You know the first line, non-communist regimes, which was there in the Security Council Declaration. And lastly, and that is a question of further research you can go into, that in all these regime changes, the US interests have been in conflict with that of India's interests, except one or two examples. The direct conflict which you see today is between India and the US in Bangladesh. And the US statements, official statements have admitted that India had raised this issue with them, and they have tried to accommodate Indian concerns so far as Bangladesh is concerned. So what happens in Bangladesh, we do not know. But this is one example of the conflict of interest between the two. The convergence of the interest between the two is in Sri Lanka, where India was equally interested in throwing the Gotabayas out, and I think the kind of assistance which was given by us up to the tune of $4 billion which has been there, and not only that, frequent visits of Jaishankar there, support to the Arab Alliance movement which had been there, all indicate to the fact that there is a convergence. So there are areas of convergence and conflict of US regime change policies vis-a-vis India's interest, which again is an area of further research you can go into. I think I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that fantastic overview and presentation about how Americans have used regime change as a way of furthering their interests in South Asia, and how, on occasion, India, like other great powers or powers, emerging powers, has also tried to do the same in this region, successfully or not so successfully. I'll throw it open for discussion. I'll ask Professor Sahadevan, Professor South Asia first. But I had one question, which is really more topical rather than historical, which is in Bangladesh. I don't understand Bangladesh well enough to be able to understand the internal dynamics, but at least from what one observes is that there is a churning happening in Bangladesh. Growing anti-India resentment, which the presidential advisor seems to be using for his benefit on occasion, if he's indeed in charge. But on the other hand, he's also reaching out to China, whether that's posturing or whether that's reality. If that is so, and if you were to think that Bangladesh is a zero-sum game between China and the United States, where American intervention was provoked in some measure by not having complete control over Bangladesh, or Bangladesh trying to appease China, then Yunus is reaching out to China. His trip to China, his suggestion that the chicken neck area, if the Chinese were to, along with the Bangladesh, have access to the chicken area that would cut off India's northeast from India, it's a bit bizarre. Unless there is some deeper strategic puzzle that we are not being able to figure. Why is he doing it? If he is an instrument of American deep state politics, to use the current popular phraseology, then why is he trying to balance China, or is that part of the strategy, and also reaching out to Pakistan at the cost of India? Now, if also simultaneously, as the establishment of today seems to suggest, that India, US have an unprecedented strategic convergence, and the US is trying to position India as a potential balancer to China, then to be able to create problems for India in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh collusion with Pakistan again is a puzzle which I have not been able to unravel. But perhaps we could take a few questions and then you could answer them. Uday, Baha, Bharat, similarly.
I'll ask later.
So please then, yeah, please go ahead, Raj.
So, good afternoon, sir.
Mike,
Good afternoon, sir. And lecture was brilliant, and of course, came to know a lot about regime change and the role of US so far as this regime change has been concerned, and serious nuances you have taken care of. Recently, this is like since last 3 years, it's been like Russia, Ukraine, the serious issues been going on. Rather, I will say it's a kind of war. And now US under the of course under the Biden also regime, US has intervened, and so far as in order to resolve or in order to provide aid, and so far from all way it's been given to the Ukraine. But now since Trump is also considering resolving this issue, so basically how do you see, is there any role of US, or is US planning for some regime change in Ukraine as well? How do you see that?
Yeah. Uday.
Sir, I have a couple of questions. You started your discussion by talking about how regime change as an instrument serves America's interest. But recently I was having a kind of discussion on this book by Professor John Gatesheimer, The Israel Lobby. So I can come across two regime changes, and my question is, were those regime changes actually in American interest? The first one, of course, whatever is happening in the Middle East, you started by talking about the Iraqi regime change, Libya, Syria, even Wesley Clark, the four-star general of the Supreme NATO Commander Europe from 1997 to 2000, he revealed that he got a memo from, which was actually influenced by the Israel, that they wanted to overthrow Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. So was it actually serving United States national interest? If we look at the second regime change that happened in 2014, the Maidan uprising of overthrowing Yanukovych government, right? Because the US basically wanted NATO expansion, but the US do not recognize the security needs of Russia, right? So what we are seeing here, of course, the middle Russia-Ukraine crisis. So in both of these cases, we see that it is not actually serving United States interest. So whose interest is it actually serving?
One more last question and then we'll, no, let's just ask him.
So my question is on the same line as the word dean, that if Yunus was in US asset, then his trip to China and his bizarre remarks and that Muni Airways sources, it doesn't make sense. Can you please expand on that?
Well, I think first from Bangladesh, there are a couple of things which I want to say here. The Indians had been accepting the Americans had been accepting the Indian primacy in Bangladesh all these years, assuming that India will do it in one way or the other. The two things which is spoiled was, one is of course the way Hasina ran about the show, which further alienated them, there is no doubt about it. But secondly, there was some sort of a feeling growing both in India and the US that India alone cannot balance China in its own neighborhood. That's not true only for Bangladesh, it's true for all other countries, including Sri Lanka, including Nepal. As a result, there is a very significant shift in India's regional policy. India always felt that this is their area of prime concern and nobody should come here there. Since 2013 particularly, but I would say beginning of this century, somehow the Chinese assertion is there. It's a different China, all said and done. The China earlier came to the rescue of the South Asian countries whenever they felt squeezed vis-a-vis India. And it made certain statements, we help you, support you for your independence, this and that, whatever else it is. And beyond that, nothing much. But with the beginning of this century, and particularly with the President Xi coming in, China has its own stakes in South Asia, which very few people are realizing and emphasizing on that. Why have they stakes? Because if Tibet and Xinjiang have to be stabilized, then South Asian neighbors' support is absolutely essential. Many of you know that the Xinjiang border with Pakistan is being manned by both Pakistan army and the Chinese troops. In Tibet, the refugees come to Nepal, they come to India, they go to all these areas. The Chinese don't like it and they would like to manage directly with them. Then they have a fear of the so-called Malacca dilemma, they are having their own BRI. Largely BRIs, etc. have come out of that in order to get out of these constraints which are there. So China now has a lot of money than what it had earlier, which it can invest. Therefore, China has a lot of money. China has a will to interfere into these countries. At many places, it is trying to bring the communists together, trying to create coalitions which are more pliable to them. Therefore, China is an active player in South Asia. And today, if a South Asian country even does not want to have relations with China, it will be forced to have relations with China. Now, therefore, in Bangladesh, India realized it and we started collaborating with the US, we started collaborating with Japan. These two countries very clearly. In case of the US, we have been promoting the MCC, which is a new, of course, Trump, I'm not talking Trump, we are talking of the Trump has just about 2 months, so we still have to see how Trump unfolds himself. But Trump also washed his hands on Bangladesh in the press conference which he had with Modi when there was a question for Prime Minister Modi, what about Bangladesh? He said, you ask him. He did not say that what has happened in Bangladesh is wrong or right. So he left it on India and largely saying, this is your baby, you deal with it. And we don't like the way it has been dealt with in this way. Therefore, one reason is that it's a question of the Chinese assertion. Firstly. Secondly, UNIS is brought about by the US, but lot of the movement which took place against Hasina had a tremendous support from Jamaat-e-Islami and BNP. And this is where the role of both Pakistan and China is very significant. Now, Yunus being on the chair, he realizes what are the pressures there. China had been working even with Hasina, and lot of aid assistance and programs are there which Yunus cannot wish away, particularly when the US has withdrawn the support and he sees trouble coming from India. So going to China is not really balancing the US. Going to China is balancing India, so far as Yunus is concerned. Going to China is balancing the domestic pressures in Bangladesh which Yunus faces there. So that's how you explain the present dynamics in which we are trying to see, and we know both these reasons that after Hasina gone, Pakistan and China will become more important influential factors in Bangladesh has been conveyed umpteen time diplomatically by India to the US. But now they don't know. Now, therefore, postponing of elections
is a very critical issue because Yunus may not get elected again. He doesn't have a political constituency in Bangladesh. He is popular for various other reasons, whatever else it is. So this is how I think you should look at the US role so far as Bangladesh and South Asia generally is concerned. Coming to, there is a 5E. I am not talking about other countries, but the US works in collaboration with its allies. And Israel is one of the finest collaborators or allies of the US. So to say that US is doing independent of Israel or Israel will do without taking US into confidence, I mean, Gaza problem has brought about many other nuances into it, but the fact remains that broadly speaking, the West Asian strategy of Middle East strategy of US is dovetailed with what the Israelis do. Israel is both an instrument and a factor. Therefore, don't say that whether it is US specific interest or it is Israeli specific interest. The specific interest is the Muslim population, the radicalism which is there. Even in when I was talking about Europe, Middle East, the ideological parameters when he says, when Trump says that we are not going to send our armies to construct democracies there, because he is now facing a radical Islam threat. Communism is not that much of a threat for him now. That is the end of history. It had happened earlier. So there are evolving parameters of how the regional context is changing and how the global context is changing. So you will have to fit in your foreign policy of regime change also within those parameters. You can't completely devoid of that. So this is what it is happening. And I think the shift in the India's regional policy is that earlier we did not want anybody else, now we cannot do without anybody else.
So India's Monroe doctrine is dead, or Indira Gandhi doctrine is dead, and now
It's compromised. That is a very strong word. It compromised, at least for the time being, as supposedly. But I don't think the way we have, this is not the audience to talk about, the way we have meshed neighborhood first policy. Some other day we'll talk about it.
But remember, sir, as you pointed out, China is a different actor. Chinese diplomacy is different. I was in Moscow, and the Chinese ambassador in Moscow today acts like the viceroy. He's so influential. The last Chinese ambassador to Nepal was a friend of Muni sir, I think. She was like a Hollywood actress, a Bollywood actress. I thought she may have been an admirer of yours.
I'm not friendly with Bollywood actors.
But finally, is there any other question? But quickly, because it's 1:30 and we don't want to deprive.
So, US has also been involved with toppling democratic governments, like for example the chicken case that you highlighted. You brought out how the things say. So, what does it say about democracy to Muslim? And secondly, so regarding regime changes in South Asia, 10 years old, what sources should we rely on? Should we rely on like private or public sources?
So the question is, which is, Professor Muni has relied on National Security Archives, and I know and remember when he was in Washington, he spent time looking at the public records in America. The good thing about America is they declassify everything after 25 years. So you find out. In India, you're never able to find out.
In the Indian case?
Indian case, it's anecdotal, I guess, because you never declassify records. But you speak to policymakers, you'll find out usually.
There is a
One report that
just a minute.
IRI reports
The National Security Archive in US, Wilson Center has it, or had it until Doge attacked them. But you look at some of the State Department's own declassified archives, they're the best source. Even the redated reports are the best source on American policy.
There is a new book, if you want to refer, by McGurk, 2024 publication. The title is Spying in South Asia.
Yeah, it's just
Britain, the United States of America, and India's secret Cold War.
I have a copy of it in case you want to borrow it, but it's available on Amazon.
And what does it say? He was reacting to, in one of the interviews, the author was reacting to the question of Mrs. Gandhi's foreign hand. He says the foreign hand allegation of Mrs. Gandhi is somewhat exaggerated. He did not say unfounded.
So it's not unfounded at all.
So that's where it is that, well, you know, the data is, as Amitabh says very rightly, data is more easily accessible so far as US policy is concerned. With us, this kind of a data, but look, many of the raw chiefs, raw agents are now coming out with their biographies. The problem with us is that we are not sometimes very rigorous researchers. I mean, Professor Google solves everything, and you don't go beyond that. That's where the problem is.
All great powers, I think the one great lesson is all great powers indulge in these activities. The Americans have done it. India tried to do it, not very successfully. The Chinese are doing it. Anecdotally, example, I'll tell you that the number of people who, faculty and students who get invited by China today is 5 times more than what Americans invite from the School of International Studies. As Dean, at least I have access to the data of the number of people who get all paid trips to China. This is how great powers influence policy in
But
some
India,
small fashion.
Amitabh, India has not always been unsuccessful.
Sikkim was a great example of a success.
No, Sikkim is just one example. Replete examples in case of Nepal. The question of Hasina being kept in power for last 15 years and more. The question of General Irshad taking over. The Indo-Bangladesh relationship took a turn for better for India when General Irshad came to power.
Incidentally, one of the best movies made, recognized internationally in terms of espionage and spy thrillers, which I have seen 2-3 times, and Muni Saab, of course, will know the has a deeper understanding of that, is Madras Cafe, which you should see. Bhagwat Saab.
Sir, I really thoroughly enjoyed whatever the insights you have given. About Bangladesh, I like to make some submissions and also slightly different on one issue. You know, when we understand Bangladesh politics and in the context of US, Jamaat-e-Islam had been traditionally allied of the US in case of Bangladesh. In 1971, we can see, and even today also, that there were close nexus, but ISI and Jamaat-e-Islam was facilitated by the Americans. In the recent developments, there are a number of evidences that can be very important point is that assassination of Mujibur Rahman. Of course, it was Baksal that he has come out with one party system and disliking. The assassination of Ziaur Rahman was also was under in the knowledge of the CIA, and CIA was somehow influencing that assassination of Ziaur Rahman because Ziaur Rahman had started SARC. Initiated the SARC, the regional cooperation in South Asian countries, and at the same time the Soviet invasion took place in Afghanistan. So I think somehow that they wanted to disrupt this initiative of Ziaur Rahman, and they have taken the initiative. My point is here that they are neither with the BNP. If I see that the track records of the record of the Americans, the BNP was also not the priority of the Americans. Even today also, that Americans they don't want Tariq to come back to Bangladesh. They want Jamaat-e-Islam, Mohammed Yunus to remain even, and that's why Trump also said that this is your let's India deal it regionally. And the Americans, they have traditional rivalry with Awami League and Sheikh Hasina in 1971, but in 1998 when Americans they proposed SOFA and Sheikh Hasina was the Prime Minister, she declined that she will not sign SOFA. Today also, the previous slide, Sheikh Hasina has given the statement, a white man wants a St. Martin Island and Bay of Bengal, and second that a country wants to create a Christian country out of India, Northeast and Myanmar. I think these were the two factors. The last point is that the Americans, they wanted to launch, that is also that they were, the first liking was the Mohammed Yunus. They wanted Mohammed Yunus in 2006 when there were confrontations between the two political parties, BNP and Awami League, and they also wanted Mohammed Yunus.
There is no dispute there, Sanjay.
No, but you said that PNP is the
No. Mohammed Yunus is a personal preference of the Americans always.
yes, PNP
But,
is not.
but Mohammed Yunus doesn't have a political organization behind him. Therefore, when it comes to political organizations in Bangladesh, there are only three. One is BNP, Awami League and Jamaat-e-Islam. Now, Awami League, as we all agree that they are totally alienated from Awami League. They never wanted Bangladesh to be born, they never wanted Awami League to govern. So that is absolutely true. Out of the two parties, you are also correct that Americans have taken help of the Islamic radicals at many places. But they would not be, at the same time, they also have very sore experience of the Islamic radicals. Therefore, Jamaat-e-Islami may have blessings incidentally or occasionally or when you want them, but they are not the final preference. Tomorrow, if the election happens, and you will watch it more closely than I do, if Americans have any role to play, they will be helping BNP rather than Jamaat-e-Islami. It's very, very clear about that. Now, if that is all I am saying. I have no problem in their being indifferent or they being less hostile to the Jamaat-e-Islami. But once you bring in Jamaat-e-Islami and BNP, the Pakistan and China factor cannot be avoided. Because from 1975 until the 90s, later on, late 90s, the China and Pakistan ruled the roast in Bangladesh. They were the one, they are the most entrenched powers there. Therefore, that's what it is. There is not much of it. Yunus is a personal, individual supporter of the US, but political force, Yunus is not. I mean, how many people we can gather today when it comes to politics? So not much difference, but don't distinguish between Yunus and BNP. Yunus has no problem with BNP, provided he is recognized as it is.
Is there any final thoughts, or then I'll wait? Nadeem, after one question is enough. Nadeem, what is the urgent? Kya hai?
Sir, my question is regarding Iran's nuclear facility and its location. I was originally
Professor Muni doesn't have the answer to all the world's questions. This is on South Asia regime.
So he's talking about
Iran and
Hirkabi.
Okay, now I have the pleasure of requesting Dr. Vineet Prakash to deliver a formal vote of thanks.
So this could have gone on for a very long time, but we have to bring it to a closure. So I would begin by thanking Professor S.D. Muni for being here with us and for delivering this truly inspiring and thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure many in the student community who are present over here would derive from his ideas and take it up further in the research work. I would also like to thank our Dean, Professor Amitabh Bhattu, for his initiative to mark the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the school and his efforts to showcase the strength of the school before the entire world. And I would also like to thank the team behind organizing this series of lectures, the 70th anniversary series, which is led by Professor Preeti Singh and other members. And finally, I would like to thank all the distinguished faculty members who are present over here, and of course, all the students who took out time to be with us. Thank you so much.